What's going on, everybody, and welcome to episode 99 of the Book Binge, where I'm redoing this one, at least part of the way through, because OBS disconnected all of my audio stuff again, so always fun. I just had to reset some stuff, and I've restarted the recording. This week we are doing The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan's second book of The Wheel of Time, which was advertised as a big step up from the first book, and it indeed was. And I already loved the first book, so that's gonna play a huge part in how I feel about this one going into the good of it. Speaking of, let's just kind of go ahead and jump into the actual review itself, because this book and the series don't really need much more introduction than that. Of course, the first thing that I'm going to say I loved about The Great Hunt was the sudden expansion of the world and the continued way in which Jordan continues to drop his history and lore, with certain times it just being like little hints of stuff, like I said, dropped perfectly for me. Other times being a little bit more expositional without feeling like info dumping per se. Just a great way to be immersed into the world and the history of it. I think Jordan does a great job with that. Speaking of expansion, I also enjoyed the expansion of POVs in this book. Now, Eye of the World was primarily just Rand's POV. It was probably like 85% or so of that book was just Rand, and then the remainder of it was for a small section in the middle of it where the party got split up a little bit, and a few of the other characters had one or two, POV chapters apiece, but otherwise that book was almost entirely Rand. Now, this book does also have mostly Rand's POV, to be fair, but there's also a lot of other stuff as well. You get plenty of POV from Egwene as well, and some other characters, and a couple POVs from additional characters that, don't really get much of the story otherwise, such as Bail Damon, the shipmaster, and another White Cloak character in a specific part of the world have just a couple POVs each, but they are used effectively for the most part. The plotting of the book was also super tight when you consider the POVs and the way that a lot of the characters from the party of the first book are separated in some sense for a good chunk of this book in one form or another. The way that the plotting was figured out and essentially dropped worked very well for me. I thought it was super effective, and that Jordan did a great job with his storytelling in this one. Where Eye of the World was a bit more straightforward, this one wasn't quite as straightforward, but was still super tight nonetheless. The character arcs as well, speaking of the POVs, and the way that they go about in this book, I thought the character arcs are already starting to look brilliant here. The way that a couple characters have already changed at least a tad, or the way that you can see they're shifting a little bit, or that they might shift or change over the rest of the story, potentially. I continue to be surprised as well by mostly great character interactions for the most part. There are some that I'm still not super hot on, a couple characters that I, don't necessarily love, or a couple interactions or scenes that I don't necessarily love. But for the most part, I'm surprised by the character interactions when, character work, or at the very least, believable characters isn't necessarily one of the things that Jordan is frequently called a master of in the course of the series. But I love getting to see certain characters from other characters' eyes every once in a while, which is one of the things that I loved so much about the POV expansion. The fact that the book isn't entirely Rand, and there's a little bit more of other POVs going on here. You get to see or hear some of the other characters' experiences or thoughts about Rand and some of the other characters as well, and I love that. You can also tell that character arcs over the course of the entire series are going to be a huge part of it, and I think it might be one of the things that I enjoy most of the series throughout. We'll see how strongly that holds up, but I anticipate that being the case. Also, great and important character moments as well, divided between the various POVs. There's some scenes for most of the major POVs that are all very great. There's one in particular, I don't remember which chapter number it was, but the chapter titled The Testing for Nynaeve. Fantastic chapter that actually made me feel different about her character compared to how I did before, because I was not hot on her character before. In fact, I don't even know if I'm necessarily a fan of her character now, but at least I understand her a bit more. The expansion of the POVs has facilitated a lot of these sort of experiences and thoughts that I have about some of the other characters that has actually deepened my relationship with the story as well as with the characters. Like I mentioned before, additions to the lore and world building, particularly where they apply to the plot, and these characters are great. There's the statue at Carrion, which is one that for Rand I thought was a really cool, like little hint at stuff. There's the Shan Chan and how they interact with the story. There's the Mirrors of the Wheel, just kind of like these all vague things that if you've read the book or read the story, you know what I'm talking about, but if you haven't, you don't. So, it's not spoilery to mention these things, but just the drops and the way that Jordan is not just telling you things about the history, he's using things from the history in the story now in ways that I think are rather enjoyable. There are less dream sequences this time around, but the ones that were there are all fantastic as usual. In fact, there's a couple of them that are significantly stand out. The prologue was really good. On a similar note, I loved being able to make a prediction on this that I think turned out being right. It seemed like it was rather obvious to some, but I tend to not pick up on stuff like that super easy, but I really enjoyed the prologue to this one. It was a little bit more straightforward than, say, the prologue to book 1 was, which basically had to be explained after the fact. This one was a little bit more straightforward, even if the prediction was about which character was involved in it. The other hints and everything else being dropped at just the right times and just the right ways to make the theorizing and discovering answers to questions in the entire story, because this was something that I liked, like I mentioned about the prologue, but just the whole book in general. I thought that being able to theorize and whatnot throughout the story was just a really, really fun time. The whole structure and the plotting of this book, especially when combined with what happened in the first book, just had me predicting some things about POVs as well for book 3. So not even just consolidated to this book. I made a prediction in my last spoiler talk on this book about book 3 that I'm excited to find out about when I read that next month in September. But with that being said, not everything about the book is perfect. The bad, let's just talk about a couple of the POVs. I thought that started off interesting. A couple of them I did mention a bit earlier, some of the one-off POVs, but then they just started to do nothing for me as they started to go along, the next couple times that they appeared, including in the climax, which I just thought I didn't want or need their scenes at all for some reason. I don't know why, but there were a couple of those minor POVs that I just did not care about. And then there was a particular world building element that I did also mention earlier as well, but I'm not going to mention it again here just for, spoiler-free sake, I suppose, which didn't fully satisfy me in one sense, but it was fun and used in interesting ways regardless. The ugly of The Great Hunt is that the POV expansions and flip-flopping really started to mess with my diary structure. So what I was doing with the first book was basically I was just going through what I read chapter by chapter, essentially, like bringing up what I thought was important to bring up or that I thought was particularly worth noting. And basically that happened chapter by chapter for the most part. There was the one section where there were multiple POVs, but it was a short enough section that it didn't really change the structure of that diary too much. Whereas this book, by the time I got to that second POV, some of them got to be really long because I had to find a way to try to talk about everything that happened without going back and forth between all the POVs and just trying. It kind of messed with the structure of the diaries, like I said. I can't imagine that this will get any better through the rest of the series. In fact, it will probably be worse. I see a lot more diaries and plenty of those diaries being quite lengthy in the future, but that is just what's going to happen. In terms of the recommendation, kind of like what I said with The Eye of the World, it's kind of hard to recommend something that is so well known, so widely read in the first place. But if you read the first book like me for the first time and want to know whether you should continue if you didn't love the first book, because I did love Eye of the World, but not everybody does love Eye of the World. Basic recommendation for The Great Hunt is yes, if you enjoyed Eye of the World enough, or like what it's, where it's going at least, give The Great Hunt a try. And if it still doesn't work for you, that's apparently where people tell you, like, if neither of the first two books, or if The Great Hunt doesn't do anything for you, it might just not be the series for you. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. It was absolutely the step up that everybody advertised it as being. But yeah, that is the end of this review. It's a little bit of a shorter one, it seems like. That's all well and good as well. There's nothing wrong with having a little bit of a shorter video every once in a while, but here in a couple weeks, I will be beginning book 3. So if you've read through the first couple books, or if you're rereading, or if you just want to follow along with my reading anyway, and you've read like the whole series, for example, check that out when those start coming out on every Thursday of September. That is when I'll start doing those. I'm very, very highly looking forward to the book. Like, I just am. I really enjoyed these first 2 books, and I've been a little bit surprised by that. I went into Eye of the World hoping for, you know, a 3-star plus experience, and it ended up being an easy 5-star for me. So the fact that I've loved these first 2 books so much, it just has me really encouraged. So I'm looking forward to book 3. With that being said, I hope you all join me for those diaries like I mentioned, and the subsequent review to come probably in October. But that is what's going down. This Thursday is my special 100 episodes, you know, celebratory episode, essentially, because it will be my 100th episode of the Book Binge, which is awesome, but also kind of crazy to think about. So if you're interested in that, it's a little bit of a lengthy one, but I had a fun time with it. So I hope I will see you there in the next video.